The collective West is going through collective stages of grief as they're trying to grapple with the reality that Ukraine is not turning out the way that it was planned and that defeat is on the horizon. You might know these, where are they? Here they are, the 5 stages of grief of terminally ill patients, right? And this is pretty much where the collective West is at the moment. It starts out with denial, you go to anger, and then into a bargaining stage, depression and acceptance. Simple, very simple model, probably not always true. Of course, not always true. I mean, everything is difficult, but this is not a bad rule of thumb. And the collective West at the moment is somewhere between stage 1 and stage 2 when we look at the publications that are coming out from Europe and the United States at the moment. Let's start with the first one that came out today or yesterday, December 18, in, again, Foreign Affairs, Europe's Emerging War Fatigue. How to shore up falling support for Ukraine. This piece is, again, quite interesting because Foreign Affairs, of course, tries to base its propaganda on some real-world data. But, with real-world data, you can prove anything that you want. But it is interesting that Foreign Affairs is not ignoring them. It's just more using quite inconvenient facts in order to argue their case for more war. Let's go through this for a moment. The momentum generated by Ukraine's success in the first year of the conflict has given way to a sense that, despite ongoing fighting, the front line is not moving, and the risk of a frozen conflict is growing. It's interesting that they say that the conflict has given way to a sense. It's just a sense that the front line is not moving. It's not the reality. It's not a fact. It's just a sense. Again, in these stupid peasants in all of these countries that are now tired of this war, they get this sense that the front line is not moving. Interesting phrasing, right? These concerns help explain the shift in attitudes on display in the surveys conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations. This public opinion polling suggests that European support for Ukraine's continued fight has started to decline. In January 2023, in 10 European countries, 38% on average wanted Ukraine to regain all its territory. But according to the ECFR's latest survey from September and October, this number has now dropped to 34%. Support for the war is decreasing. Oh no, it's a problem. Interesting that it is being discussed, of course. Like we get the actual numbers. We're not in the Stalinist times yet, where they will lie to us out front and maintain that there's 99% support for something. They give us still the real numbers, supposing that's true. But then they bring in the spin, right? With their publics on board, European leaders have signed up to provide Ukraine with impressive amounts of aid. So this is why it's important that there is support, right? Here, the article explains why this is a problem. Because in 2022, only because so much support came from the publics, the EU governments were able to provide aid. In total, they say like 145 billion have been given to Ukraine, with public knowledge, of course, right? So this is why you need the public behind you. And they're now worried that this support is eroding, right? Support for Kiev is now under pressure, and under pressure is a very kind way of phrasing this. There are still countries where the preference of Ukraine to regain all its territory rather than for the war to end as soon as possible prevails by 63 to 13% in Estonia. No surprise there, right? In the Baltics, by 46 to 24% in Denmark, and 43 to 22% in Poland, and by 41 to 19% in the United Kingdom. So the northern European countries and Baltic countries, they support the population still support massively the war effort. But these four differ from more dovish countries where the opposite view, so the war to end as soon as possible, is dominant. So in the following countries, people want the war to end as soon as possible by 46 to 14 in Italy, 40 to 28 in Germany, 38 to 16 in Romania, and the French are currently divided equally, 28 to 28%. which also means that the third option, I don't know, or whatever it must have been, was chosen by more than 50%, right? This also tells us quite a bit, because those people are also not firmly behind the war, right? But in all these countries, numbers for the more hawkish option have gone down since January. Yeah, well, that's a problem. The most consequential change appears to be taking place in Germany, where a dovish option now leads with a clearer margin, 40 to 28%, than at the beginning of the year, 39 to 33. So even in Germany, the support for the war is waning, it's going away. The view that Russia is the chief obstacle to peace has also decreased in every European country since the time ECFR asked about it in April 2022. The drop is slight. On average, it is a decrease of only 8 percentage points. A majority of Europeans, 52%, still consider Russia as the main obstacle to peace, while less than a quarter blame the United States, Ukraine, or the EU. But 20 months ago, the proportion was 60 to 19. So, this is just a very clear trend, right, across the board. And also, like, for who started this war, or who is responsible for the war, who's responsible for it, right? Even that perception seems to be changing. And then it goes into like certain, the article talks about a couple of reasons for this, like war fatigue. Where is it coming from? Like, accepting Ukrainian refugees is very burdensome. And then changes in the political landscape, like in Slovakia, where Robert Fico won the premiership, won the parliamentary elections. And that in Germany, the AfD is on the rise. I mean, it's now the second largest party by polling. Not they didn't have general elections yet, but by polling it would win 22% of German voters, and that's huge. And the AfD is decisively against supporting Ukraine with more weapons and prolonging the war, right? Or take the Netherlands, where the far right Freedom Party, where Geert Wilders unexpectedly won the parliamentary election last November. So this is across the board. The warmongers and neocons are now panicking because the general publics in Europe are kind of catching on to the scheme, and they're trying to poll this. And now the interesting thing is what this article then prescribes, right? Our data also show weak confidence among Europeans that Ukraine can win this war. So people are catching on, and they're catching on rapidly, right? People just don't think very much anymore that this can be won. In September, only in a handful of countries surveyed, Denmark, Estonia, Poland, Portugal, was there a prevailing view that Ukraine was likely rather than unlikely to win the war within the next 5 years. Considerably fewer people shared that belief in France, Germany, Romania, Switzerland, and even the United Kingdom. Weak confidence in Ukraine's chances for victory does not necessarily mean people expect Russia to win either. So this is still like they're interpreting the data that they have received and so on and so forth. But the direction is very clear. People in Europe do not really believe that this is going to go anymore the way it should, right? Or that it was told them that it would. But then, of course, the final part of the article is theory of victory. Arguably the most significant support Europe can offer Ukraine is membership in the EU as the only way to lock in its future as a European prosperous and democratic country, with all the guarantees of financial and security support that EU membership entails. And of course, they're talking about, the great victory of accession talks. So this is like this little glimmer of hope on the horizon at the moment for the neocons. Here it becomes clear why European public opinion on the war matters so much. Internal EU Council estimates forecast that around 200 billion in EU funds would flow to Ukraine over 7 years after accession. So, okay, this is a bitter pill to swallow, right? To make Ukraine a EU state, everybody knows, and even the neocons admit, that this is going to cost a lot of money, and this is probably a best case scenario. So if they guess that it will be 200 billion, better triple or quadruple that number in order to get anywhere close to the actual amount of money needed to more or less properly integrate Ukraine. And that's outside of the entire disputes that they're going to be having over, Ukrainian grain exports to the rest of the EU during the accession process and so on. I mean, this is going to be a huge mess. I do think that adding Ukraine to the European Union is going to be at least as painful as taking the United Kingdom out of it. That's going to be a huge pain. But okay, they want to set them up for this kind of mess at the moment. Paying more to Ukraine is not a development that existing EU citizens would accept lightly. Yeah. People don't like paying so much for others, especially when then the real economic pain starts setting in. So to guard against this, Europe's leaders need to show deeper understanding for the cost of living crisis and why some Europeans link their economic difficulties to the war in Ukraine. Yeah, because it is linked. They link it because it is linked, because like more money to Ukraine, less money for you, and less development over here, and all of these kind of problems, right? As these European countries don't spend on their own populations, but then spend on war. They love spending on war. So, and here it continues, they should frame the conflict as a Russian war against Europe, not just against Ukraine. So this is how you know then that this is really just pure propaganda, right? Because the article ends in concrete steps to take to get more war. So the leaders should frame the conflict by Russia against the EU, which is exactly what they've been doing. I mean, just do more of the same, right? European leaders need to develop a stronger case for EU enlargement. More propaganda. That's what the article says. Just push out more propaganda in order to convince your populations. For any of this to be credible, however, European leaders need to develop a more convincing case for how Ukraine can win. Now, good luck with that one. I mean, the only case you can make is to continue living in fairy tale land and just ignore what's happening. So I guess that has to be the strategy, right? Let's ignore the facts on the battlefield, even if the current regime of Kiev is like forced to evacuate and go into exile. You will still pretend that this is the only legitimate government, and that this government can still and will still win. La résistance, the way that La France resisted the Germans. But that's where it's probably going to go in the end. But never admit defeat. So very clearly, denial, the denial stage of grief. And that's what this article is about. And then we've got the New York Times that two days ago came out with an article that more goes into the second stage, of anger. Because the New York Times is really angry that Putin turned a Western boycott into a bonanza. Soon after Russian troops invaded his country, the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky made a plea to Western companies. Leave Russia, he said. Make sure that the Russians do not receive a single penny. This homepage is like ridiculously overloaded, but I'm sorry about that. That's just the New York Times trying to be fancy. Hundreds of companies answered the call. Politicians and activists predicted that it would help strangle the Russian economy and undermine the Kremlin's war efforts. President Putin had other plans. Mr. Putin has turned the exits of major Western companies into a windfall for Russian loyal elite and the state itself. He has forced companies wishing to sell to do so at fire sale prices. He has limited sales to buyers anointed by Moscow. Sometimes he has seized firms outright. Now, get this, a New York Times investigation. The journalists, the good journalists from the New York Times, the brave men and women, they went on an investigation with their notepads, and then they did this brave investigative journalism, right? They traced how Mr. Putin has turned an expected misfortune into an enrichment scheme. How dare he? How dare he? How dare he? This was supposed to ruin the guy. It was supposed to ruin Russia, and it didn't ruin Russia. How dare they? It's an enrichment scheme. It's illegal. It's bad. It's evil. You can really see the tantrum that's being thrown around here, right? He has also subjected those exits to ever-increasing taxes, generating at least 1.25 billion in the past year for the Russian war chest. No private deal is safe. The Dutch beer company Heineken, for example, found a buyer this spring and set a price, but the Russian government unilaterally rejected the deal. People close to the negotiation said, and put the company's Russian holdings in the hands of an aerosol packaging titan married to a former Russian senator. In all, Mr. Putin has overseen one of the biggest transfers of wealth within Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. So we don't even need to read much more of this article. We will just do a little bit, but this is the entirety of the article. Just tries to to show how evil it is that Putin and Russia is interfering in private deals of companies that wish to exit, and how it is so nefarious that then the Russian state is expropriating all of these companies that are leaving Russia and making a profit out of it, while not crushing these products that are being produced and consumed in Russia. Because overall, it seems that the people who wrote this article, that they had the idea that the companies going out of Russia, they will take all of their goods with them, all of the Heineken, all of the beer, and everything will leave Russia, and Russia will have no more beer, Russia will have no more industrial capacity, everything is going to be gone, the economy is going to collapse because all of the Western companies are gone, and of course the Russian state has no ways, it has no tools at its disposal to keep that from happening, because the companies, they dictate and own everything in the United States and in Europe, right? They dictate policy. So it was probably unimaginable for New York Times journalists that the opposite could be the case, that it is possible that a state dictates the terms of engagement to its companies. Which actually, I'm just hyperbole, right? I mean, also in the United States and in Europe, it is clearly the governments that are in charge when it comes to regulating companies. So the idea of these people that an exit of companies would cripple the Russian economy was funny to begin with. And by now, it's just ludicrous and ridiculous. Because it continues like this. The entire article is just like one after another, how today in Russia, robust consumer world carries on, helping Mr. Putin maintain a sense of normalcy despite war that has proved longer, deadlier, and costlier than he predicted. They still try to frame everything as in, Russia actually is still close to the collapse, but normalcy is just a phantom, but it has helped, these kind of strategies. But apparently, obviously, these people couldn't believe that it is possible for Russia to impose its terms, on these entities that operate on its soil. So, and the article actually then talks about all of the ways in which the state, of course, wins over companies because it has the monopoly of power, right? And apparently this is a big surprise to the West, and it makes them angry. So the West is angry that the Russians are able to succeed, a Moscow supermarket offers Pepsi from Uzbekistan and Coca-Cola. So there's circumvention strategies, right? How these certain goods can still enter the Russian market. Then there's other strategies of the Russian companies taking over foreign companies like Krispy Kreme donuts. The donuts are still the same, just the name has changed, and the owner of those establishments have changed. And then there's another strategy further down here, but this one is interesting. I find this man quite hilarious. In the United States, there was perhaps no more vocal figure than the Yale University management professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. He appeared on cable news programs criticizing companies that remained in Russia. He even created like blacklists, giving like very bad marks to Western companies that remained in Russia. If Putin thinks he can do better at the deep fryer, let him have at it. He said in an interview, "We really don't care. The important thing is to not have the endorsement of a renowned global brand." So he's one of the people who pushed. You remember, like 1.5 years ago, the United States and Europe, they pushed their companies to leave the Russian market. And well, obviously, this has, again, just like the sanctions, it hasn't rendered the results that were expected. So this German hardware store Obi, they were forced to sell their stores to somebody who was not on a Russian blacklist, and then this person got this as a discount, and then a few months later, somebody completely differently owned Obi, and somebody much more closer to the Russian state, to Mr. Putin, right? So there's hundreds of ways to actually deal with these stupid policies of blockade and restricting trade and pressuring companies to go out. And of course, Russia has counter strategies. That's what they said from the very beginning, that they would deal with this problem the way they've dealt with it before. And that they have strategies, and obviously, the Russian economy is in much better shape than it was before. Let's go to the end. Professor Sonnenfeld and others kept up the pressure. More than 200 companies had earned an F grade on his blacklist of not complying companies. Professor Sonnenfeld testified before Congress in November 2022. Remaining in Russia, he said, was tantamount to supporting the government. But it shows that these companies exiting the Russian market also didn't help. But the thing is, they're now angry. I mean, the New York Times, these people are now seriously angry with Russia not collapsing. And so that's the second stage of anger. And at some point, I do hope that we get to stage number 3, where they will start the bargaining process once it sets in that the inevitable is going to come, and that it's better to start bargaining sooner than later, because it's going to save thousands, tens of thousands of lives every month. That this war continues is a useless, senseless month with senseless dying. So get on with it, get over your denial, get over your anger, and go to bargaining stage now, please, dear Collective West. Thank you.